sorry to folks that have been here since before 5, but I just want to let any folks that have just joined us know that we'll be beginning at 5 after. So sit tight, we'll get going in just a moment. All right, we're officially at 5 after. Thank everyone for their patience. And yeah, welcome to the Community Forum on Citywide Parking Reform. I am going to share my screen. I'm going to be using a PowerPoint to guide the discussion this evening. So I'm going to just start that by sharing my screen. All right. And can everybody see the slide okay? I hope that's visible to folks. I just made it full screen, so I hope folks are able to see it there. All right, so we are here, as I mentioned, to talk about citywide parking reform. So again, I really thank everyone for taking time out of their schedules to join us tonight. And I think it's really, I really want to make sure that we're using your time effectively and efficiently. So the idea is that we're going to aim to keep this to 1 hour tonight, so that we don't take too much out of everyone's schedules here. Roughly 40 minutes of a presentation and 20 minutes of Q&A. So that's roughly the idea. All right, so here's just an overview of what we'll be covering tonight. I'll start out with some basics related to parking requirements and why they were implemented here in Lake Oswego. I'll then move on to background and review of the CFEC rules and some of what they're intended to do. I'll talk a little bit about how parking requirements impact businesses here in Lake Oswego. I'll provide an overview of what the city is doing in response to the climate-friendly and equitable communities rules, and also provide some next steps for the project and just a schedule of the remaining pieces of what we're doing here. There are about 40 slides in the deck, so I just want to give you a heads up. I'll be moving fairly quickly through them, but just for sort of reference. Again, there will be more time for questions and discussion at the end of the presentation. Please feel free to ask any questions you may have via chat, and we'll address them as soon as we can. Probably the end of the presentation would be the most likely time to do that. So that is, just a sort of the best way to get your questions to us if you want to get them sooner. I would say, though, if you'd prefer to ask your question verbally, we prefer that you wait until the Q&A portion of the meeting at the end of the meeting. All right. The non-responsive slides here, I apologize. I'm going to reshare my screen. I'm not sure what was going on with the presentation there. I apologize. That's annoying. Apologies again. All right, I think I'm going to go with a PowerPoint presentation, or I'm sorry, the PDF version of this. So apologies for any difficulty here. It's taking a little bit longer than I was hoping. All right, so I'm just going to use the PDF version because I don't know what's going on with that one. All right, so I'm just going to begin with a brief overview of just parking requirements in general and a bit of background about where they sort of come from, I suppose. That's the quickest way to phrase it. Generally speaking, parking requirements are intended to, oh, hold on one second, I'm still having issues with this. Yeah, I'm so sorry. Okay, thank you for your patience here. I have no idea why this is being so difficult. One second though.
Eric, this is Jessica. If you need me to pull this up on my screen and then I can advance, let me know. I'm happy to do that too.
Yes, I think I think the problem is I'm starting a slideshow and it doesn't like that. So one second, I have it here. All right. Apologies again for the issues here. Okay. All right. So just back to get back on track here. Hopefully you can see this. So the city's existing community development code includes several requirements that developments basically must provide a specific number of parking spaces to accommodate the uses proposed on that site. The amount of spaces that are required generally varies depending on what use is being proposed. The general idea is really just to ensure that there is sufficient parking available to account for the number of vehicle trips generated by a proposed development. The requirements are fairly specific, include both a minimum and a maximum number of parking spaces. I will just, this is, I think, where I'm supposed to be. Apologies. So generally speaking, most minimum parking requirements were established during the 1960s and 1970s through surveying nearby cities or consulting what we call the ITE, or the Institute of Transportation Engineers Handbook, which essentially outlines a number of different sort of land uses and minimum parking requirements for those land uses. Presumably they used the one from 1960 or earlier when those parking requirements were being developed. You can see that there are a fairly wide range of parking requirements that is covered in that handbook, and to an extent it is difficult to sort of understand how they get such specific ratios for something like an ultralight flight park, a taxi stand, a slaughterhouse, nightclubs, asylums, convents, etc. It's a fairly specific list of uses, and I think a lot of folks point out that it is sort of difficult to find justification specifically for where they came from. I think sort of along those lines, there's no explicit rationale that we could find in the city's legislative history for when this was adopted for why the parking requirements were adopted at that time. So this is actually directly from the meeting minutes of the city council meeting when the original parking requirements were adopted in the city. Essentially, the city attorney at that time said that they were impossible to comply with and that he had no solution to offer. So that's just a bit of context kind of for where these originally came from. So, I think this is the slide I had before, so apologies for that confusion, but just a little bit about our existing parking requirements as a city. Those are located in our code in chapter, or basically 50.06.002. There's two things that applicants can choose from to fulfill our parking requirements. They can either use what we call the numerical method or use a parking study to determine the number of spaces that would be required. Required spaces generally need to be on site. There are some exceptions in the code for things like off-site parking in certain zones, like commercial, public use, industrial, or campus institutional zones. And we do also allow and try to facilitate shared parking arrangements for different sites through reciprocal legal agreements currently. The number of required spaces in certain districts can also be reduced. So in the DRD or in Lake Grove, the parking requirement in the numerical sort of section of the code can be reduced as long as that development is within sort of a geography that we've defined that has good access to transit pedestrian or bike facilities. So a bit about the numerical method. The numerical method that the city uses is, again, in this table. So it's 50.06.0023 currently in our code. And we have different ratios in this table that we use to determine the amount of parking that is required for different uses. So for example, the city, at least based on this table, which is sort of changed by CFEC already, but let's just say formerly, the city used to require between 1 to 1.5 spaces per unit in multifamily dwellings of 5 or more units, and up to something like 13.3 spaces, for instance, per 1,000 square feet of gross floor area for an eating or drinking establishment. You can see that that's not necessarily consistent. Different commercial uses have different minimum parking requirements based on the numerical method that we currently have in our code. With respect to the parking study method, the required number of spaces for this are really determined based on the average peak parking demand generated by the proposed business or development. These must be conducted by a registered traffic engineer, and they have to consider current IT industry standards, the availability of alternate transportation, and the type of parking demand that we would expect for similar types of facilities in similar locations. One thing that I'll point out right now, and we'll talk a little bit about later in the presentation, is that this is really expensive. It requires an application fee of about $4,500, as well as the cost of hiring a traffic engineer to do all this work. So this is multiple thousands of dollars in total to sort of undertake this approach. All right, so that was a little bit about our existing rules, and now I'm just going to jump into the sort of rules that are being imposed on cities throughout the state by the state of Oregon, and sort of what those rules are intended to do. So though a lot of cities, and just kind of generally speaking with back to parking requirements, a lot of cities adopted parking requirements in the mid 20th century or so, folks have started to notice some negative externalities that those have produced. So that can include an excess of parking spaces that can have a significant negative impact on things like housing costs, business costs, housing development, business redevelopment feasibility, walkability, air and water pollution, climate pollution, and just overall kind of community character. So as a result, there's been a recent movement, I guess, to eliminate parking requirements in order to improve some of those outcomes, particularly as related to the cost of business and housing development. In Oregon, these rules and this sort of movement to eliminate parking requirements is being implemented through the state's Climate-Friendly and Equitable Communities rules, also known as CFEC. So I might use that acronym. I'll try not to sort of overload you with saying climate-friendly and equitable communities every time. But those are the rules that we're responding to as a city. So those rules require states or cities within the state's 8 metropolitan areas, including those within the Portland metro area, such as Lake Oswego, to update their comprehensive plan and development code to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, with a particular focus on reducing emissions produced by transportation. So the rules require cities such as ours to change their local transportation and land use plans to do more to ensure Oregonians have safe, comfortable ways to get around and don't have to drive long distances just to meet their daily needs. In effect, this really means promoting cleaner vehicles, cleaner fuels, and less driving through an elimination or reduction of parking requirements. So the components of CFEC that we really have been talking about the most in the past couple of years here, that really will affect the city the most, do relate to minimum parking requirements. So that's really going to be what we focus on today. So in terms of some of the rationale, beyond what I've just kind of explained very briefly for why the state has decided to do this, they see some benefits in using a market-based approach to parking that is driven more by supply and demand from the market, and not necessarily these somewhat arbitrary requirements that were adopted in some instances, over half a century ago. I think it's important to point out here, though, that no mandated parking does not mean that parking would not be provided. You can see on the slide, we have 2 examples of developments. There are numerous others, but just you can see the one on the bottom left screen of the screen here in Eugene is a development that built 2 new 700 stall parking garages, even though there was no parking requirement in Eugene at that time. Additionally, you can see there's a development called Edge Corvallis and Corvallis that provided, more than what was mandated in terms of the number of units or number of spaces per unit for their campus student housing development. So, kind of two different extremes. One provided, a modest amount more, and one provided a significant amount more than what was required. So parking uses a lot of land as well. This land often could be used more effectively for things like housing, transportation facilities, open space, or other uses that positively contribute to livability. So even in the most dense areas of Lake Oswego, there's still a significant percentage of land that is used for parking. I think it's also worth pointing out that most cities have a parking management problem, not necessarily a supply shortage. And generally speaking, more parking isn't necessarily the solution to all parking issues. So again, this is somewhat of the rationale that DLCD has put forward for these rules. Parking is also a significant expense and can displace housing. There's a few different examples that are really sort of briefly, summarized on the screen here. There was a recent study in Corvallis that showed that parking can add about $11,000 per surface parking space to a development, and that could be up to $62,000 per a garage parking space, including land and debt. Other studies have shown a similar increase in housing costs when parking is required on site. So we basically saw one study that found an increase of 10 to 20% of total housing costs. Another showed that it was about a 17% increase of total housing costs. So really, this is a really big chunk of the total number of the total expenditures that are put forward for housing. And I just close by pointing out that many parking spots are actually underused. Studies from other jurisdictions showed that between 25 and 40% of parking spots are unused, completely unused. So in King County, that's 40%. Hillsborough has 25%, and in the Bay Area, 28%. You'd imagine that they would have a very high demand for parking in that particular part of the nation. Albany has a 30% average in Oregon here. So I guess I'd also just point out that there are other sort of sustainability benefits to these parking rules and to consider with this. So it's worth pointing out that parking spaces are usually located on impermeable asphalt or concrete surfaces. That doesn't really allow for optimal retention of stormwater and can contribute heat to the urban atmosphere. So this is just a quick sort of outline of the general moves that are required for the CFEC rules. There's 5 general categories, 2 of which the city has already complied with, and 1 of which does not really apply to Lake Oswego. So just speaking just really quickly, the initial phase of the parking mandates are contained in phase A, and the city implemented those in time to meet the December 31st, 2022 deadline. There's similar requirements, sort of the first phase requirements related to electric vehicle charging, which the city implemented on March 31st, 2023, again, to meet the state deadline. There are some requirements in CFEC for some cities related to what's called housing in climate-friendly areas, which the city actually already complies with. Most cities in the metro area already comply with this because we have adopted 2 town centers, the downtown Lake Oswego and Lake Grove town centers, respectively, as a part of our previous compliance with Metro's 2040 growth concept. So really that is planning what cities that haven't sort of done that exercise will have to undertake based on these rules. More pertinent to what we're doing now is parking phase B. I think that's really what we're, again, focusing on primarily with this project, but it's worth noting that there will be a transportation systems plan update required. We originally thought that this would be something that we would need to get started on sooner, but it does turn out that we have until 2029 to get started on that work, according to the state rules. So as I mentioned, we met the deadline for parking phase A, and I'll just talk really briefly about what that entails. Essentially, as of January 1st, 2023, so it's been about a year and a half now that this has been effective, there's a number of rules that became effective within the bus line 35 corridor. So you can see that on the map here. Essentially, this is intended to capture all areas within 1/2 mile of the bus line 35 corridor. Within those areas, there are special rules that essentially no rail stations, sorry, there are special rules that no parking can be required just broadly within that area. So again, it's this half-mile distance from bus line 35 that we have to sort of use for that sort of piece. But within that yellow area, no parking has been actively required by the city of Lake Oswego since January 1st of 2023. So I suppose, we do have those regulations on the books, but we're implementing directly the state mandate. So it's kind of a quick and dirty way of meeting the compliance requirement from the state. Another thing I just point out, there are other rules here that affected things citywide. So those first two pieces, only one parking space per unit can be required for multifamily residential development citywide, regardless of where it's located. And that's currently. And no parking can be required for smaller residential units, less than 750 square feet. Affordable units, childcare uses, facilities for people with disabilities, or shelters. So that's kind of just a piece of this that the city was forced to implement early on, again, January 1, 2023. This is the other piece that the city already complies with related to electric vehicle conduit. So basically, as you may or may not be aware, ever since March 31 or March of 2023, the city has been implementing these requirements as well. And what it basically requires is for new multifamily residential developments or for new mixed-use buildings containing privately owned commercial space and 5 or more residential dwelling units, so mixed-use buildings also containing multifamily use. A minimum of 40% of all of the vehicle parking spaces are required to have conduit to serve electric vehicle charging. So that's kind of something that furthered the city's sort of implementation of electric vehicle related requirements, and is something that we're talking a little bit more broadly through some work at the Sustainability Advisory Board about a larger electric vehicle charging strategy for the city right now. But this is one piece that served that purpose related to CFEC. All right, so right now, this is kind of really, again, getting into what we're going to be talking about later. You can see that there are 3 options that the city could take to comply with Phase B of the CFEC parking reform rules. We'll come back to these later in the presentation and talk a little bit more about them, but just wanted to sort of put those out there right now. This is really how the state has opted to implement Phase B of this parking reform piece. So we'll get into those details in just a moment. Before I do that, though, I want to make sure that I mentioned some of the important sort of ways that these regulations can impact businesses. So I know that we have some data regarding how CFEC has already impacted businesses throughout the state where they have been, where they've already sort of adopted regulations to repeal minimum parking, and also kind of talking about how we see our existing minimum parking requirements impacting existing businesses in the city. So throughout the state so far, we found that, there's been some data that shows that reduced or eliminated parking mandates have really reduced barriers for new businesses. You can see on the left here, there's an example of a 1964 drive-through building in Central Point, Oregon. It has, what was considered a non-conforming parking lot by the city's regulations. And really that non-conformity served as a barrier for any reuse of the site, as new businesses would not be able to really meet the previous parking requirements without demolishing that existing structure. So parking reforms effectively, eliminated that barrier in Central Point and allowed for a new business to be located in that existing building. You can see on the right, this is another example from Tigard. This is an arcade that was, wanting to basically add a bar, or the ability to serve beer at a strip mall location. So you can imagine a strip mall location is fairly fixed. There really isn't much ability for an individual tenant to increase or modify the number of parking spaces. So they really spent months waiting for permission to be able to serve beer at this place. And basically once Tigard implemented CFEC rules to reduce and eliminate minimum parking requirements, this was resolved and he was able to add that feature to his business, this arcade. I think it's important, though, to look at examples from within our city, because there are several examples from Lake Oswego about how these requirements can serve as a barrier to new businesses locating within the city. We do have many multi-tenant and buildings in Lake Oswego that have been required to do parking studies, as I was talking about earlier, in order to fill their vacant tenant spaces. And I think basically they're doing that because they would not be able to meet the city's numerical parking standards otherwise. So again, as I mentioned, this is expensive. This can be, $4,500 plus about, a couple grand for an engineer. So really pretty prohibitive for many businesses, especially small businesses that are operating on fairly thin margins. The two cases that we see on the screen, Elephant's Deli and the Iron Light, were able to show that the existing parking on their property was sufficient to accommodate the newly proposed use. So the different types of commercial uses that are located in the Iron Light, as well as Elephant's Deli there. They were successful sort of examples of the use of this parking study. But it's worth noting that this did require each of those applications to submit several $1,000s to the city in order to just sort of show that they comply. So this is actually something that's relatively rare. We don't have a lot of businesses that do this successfully in the city through the parking study option, because it can be prohibitively expensive in many cases. More often, we find that just essentially the numerical parking standards really just prevent new businesses from locating in Lake Oswego altogether. There are several developments in the city where parking requirements often are an issue, and tenant spaces can be difficult to fill as a result, particularly for restaurant uses. So staff gathered some examples of shopping centers and retail areas throughout the city where parking requirements have prevented new businesses from moving into a space here in the city. We see two of those on the screen, Cruz Village and 16120 Boone's Ferry, where again, there were commercial tenants that were hoping to locate here that were essentially told that, sorry, you wouldn't be able to meet the parking requirement, and that effectively resulted in that business not being able to locate in the city. There's some other examples in other parts of the city: the Oswego Village Shopping Center, Lake Place, 16140 Boone's Ferry, and 7 to 10 Center Point. So really this is an unfortunately regular occurrence of the planning counter where staff has to provide this direction to businesses that are looking to locate here in the city. All right, so we're at 5:30, about halfway through the forum today. I'm going to now move into the section where we're talking a bit about what the city has done to respond to the state's rules and kind of what that's looked like. So just to talk a little bit about public engagement, we've had ongoing outreach to key project stakeholders and sort of targeted outreach since October of last year. This has included outreach to the Lake Oswego Sustainability Network, presentation to the Lake Oswego Chamber of Commerce and Lake Grove Business Committee, the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Advisory Board, as well as the Mayor's Roundtable in February was when we discussed this. I also would point out that we've maintained a project website, actually sort of a project website, as well as a more general information page that does allow folks to submit their sort of input on this through a comment form. Does answer questions with some sort of FAQ type information. We also have an email list that we use to distribute information on this project. We've held a number of different planning commission work sessions, 4 of them, as well as 4 different council study sessions, and have provided have been publishing articles within the Hello LO related to the project since October of last year as well. Of course, we're meeting tonight to talk about it as well, so this is another piece of that public engagement. So as I mentioned earlier, really, we're focusing most of our attention on the sort of Phase B parking rules. I will mention the city received a deadline extension until December 31st of this year to comply with CFEC Phase B. The idea is to align our response to these rules with our housing production strategy recommendations. That was the idea. So otherwise, we would have been required to do this last year. Basically, the state has allowed cities within, impacted cities in the state to select from one of 3 options, just like one of 3 options that they could use to comply with the law. Option 1, as they refer to it, is to repeal all parking mandates. Option 2 is to implement what they call a fair parking policy approach, or option 3, which would be more of what we're referring to as a parking management approach. So this should give you a little bit more of a detailed version of the graphic that we used earlier in the presentation, a little bit more complexity involved, and you can get a sense of the sort of difference between option one and options 2 and 3 in terms of the level of complexity. In the next few slides, we'll provide a high-level analysis of each of the options here to comply with CFEC and talk a bit about some of the pros and cons with each of them. So I made my own version of this graphic because I found it very confusing and difficult to kind of interpret. And so hopefully this will help our discussion. You can see the option 1 is fairly simple. It's a pretty straightforward repeal of minimum parking requirements throughout the city, and really nothing further is required. I will say, even though that is the most simple option, there is considerable complexity involved here. There are, a number of other parking maximum related regulations and other parking regulations for large surface parking lots that the city needs to implement for option 1. But it is still by far the least complex option. Options 2 and 3 are much more complex. There's kind of additional sub options that you can see within option 2 that would also impact city implementation. So, as I said, I broke option 2 down into separate groups. Option 2A involves the assumption that we select sub option A, which would involve the repeal of parking mandates within and a quarter mile from town centers. And there's 2B that essentially involves adopting parking management policies like paid on-street parking or other sort of, as well as kind of other reductions in parking requirements that are required for that particular approach, has space per unit for residential use, and nothing, no mandates can be required for commercial use under that option. So theoretically, you'd have to select either A or B for option 3 too. However, because option 3 requires you to eliminate minimum parking requirements basically within and a half mile from all town centers, we just assume that we go with this A here. So we can easily comply with removing parking mandates quarter mile from the town centers if we're doing it within a half mile. But that is a part of option 3 here. So anyway, I'll talk a little bit more about some of these assumptions as we move forward, but you can see that there's a lot of complexity involved in both option 2 and 3. So just to kind of unpack option 1 here, this is again simple, no further action required, just repeal all of your parking mandates again. It is actually a lot more complex than it sounds, but that is still simple compared to the other alternatives. I would note that all of the cities I'm aware of that have complied with CFEC thus far within the state have opted for option 1, including cities that are bigger than ours, such as Portland or Beaverton, or Bend and Corvallis even, or other cities that are a little bit more similar in size to Lake Oswego, like Tigard, Albany, or Central Point's a bit smaller, of course. So that's really kind of a range of cities. We can't really assume any one thing about the cities that have opted for option 1. It does seem to be the most the biggest preference for all these cities. So I'll just talk a little bit about the pros and cons with option 1. As you can see, we did some analysis of that and found that there are a lot more pros, than cons. Generally speaking, it is simple and easy to explain and understand. And as a result of that, it does reduce staff workload in interpreting and applying parking requirements. It has a low cost of implementation, really minimal to no additional cost involved here. It does result in the most flexible regulations for new businesses citywide, and most flexible regulations for development citywide through the entire, the elimination of parking requirements in general. We do think that this will reduce the cost of development as well, including housing development citywide, as I kind of touched on earlier in the presentation. It would be a pretty consistent elimination of parking requirements citywide, so there would be no kind of discrepancies in location, and it would eliminate regulatory barriers on that sort of consistent basis. We found that it would, really apply to just new development or changes of use, which wouldn't necessarily have a huge impact on existing developments, and it would allow parking to be provided in response to market demand. The one, the con that we really want to point out on this, though, is that on the flip side, option 1 could also result in some neighborhood parking overflow in some circumstances. This is true of the other options as well. But I would just point out that over the long term, the city may need to implement additional parking management policies to mitigate that potential outcome. All right, so I will try to really briefly touch on some of these more complex options here as well. or at least give you a clear understanding of them to the best of my ability. These will require a far more kind of bespoke set of parking regulations to be implemented differently in different areas of the city. So there are 8 baseline provisions that you see on the slide that would need to be adopted to comply with either option 2 or 3. I don't want to go through every single one of them, but you can see that the ones that have check marks, the city does already kind of comply with these and have provisions to that effect to a certain extent. We do have some off-site, parking allowance, but not within 2,000 feet pedestrian travel. And then we would have to, adopt new provisions for 5, 6, 7, and 8. Basically, allowing parking reductions for various different types of, provision of solar panels or wind power, car parking or car sharing spaces, electric vehicle charging stations, and accessible parking spaces. So additional kind of reductions on top of the other requirements in these options. So you also have sort of different options, as I was kind of touching on with 2A and 2B for both options 2 and 3. So in addition to what I'm going to go over, in future slides for each option, both of these options 2 and 3 would have to either remove all parking mandates within climate-friendly areas and within 1/4 mile distance of those areas. And I just want to point out, again, those are the Downtown Redevelopment Design District and Lake Grove Village Center sort of overlay district. It's the same geography. So, that would be one of the options, or implement parking management practices, such as adopting a parking benefit district with paid on-street parking and some revenues dedicated to public improvements in the area. Land use amendments to require no more than half of space per dwelling unit in that area, and adopting land use regulations that have no parking requirements for commercial. So you have to select one of 2 of those for both options 2 and 3. And I just wanted to stop here to clarify. I thought it'd be helpful to clarify how these rules would apply in the Lake Grove Town Center and Village Center overlay. We've already talked about how on the eastern side of the city, there through phase 1, parking requirements were already eliminated within that bus line 35 corridor. The CFEC phase B options will impact Lake Grove a lot more than the phase 8 ones did. So, I thought, just point out that because the CFEC rules for both options 2 and 3 are primarily oriented around town centers, and because we've already eliminated parking requirements in the sort of bus line 35 corridor, we would expect that many of the impacts for CFEC phase B would be focused in Lake Grove. The simplest way to put this is that commercial parking requirements, regardless of the option, would need to be removed within Lake Grove, regardless of where we go with this. So there really is no alternative, unfortunately, for that. There could be either a full removal of residential parking requirements or just 1 half space per unit at the most for residential. So that's kind of, sort of trying to summarize these as clearly as possible. Those are some of the barriers and parameters that we're dealing with here in Lake Grove. Dive in a little bit to option 2. We're calling this the fair parking approach, just for discussion. This, essentially requires that the city implement provisions to either require unbundled parking for residential development or require that flexible commute benefits be offered by employers of 50 or more employees. So as you can see, there's 5 different provisions. The city would need to select 2 of those provisions, but it has to be one provision from 1 through 3, and one of the provisions, either 4 or 5. Again, fairly confusing, but essentially because we have to select, either 1 through 1, 2, or 3. That means that unbundled parking or the flexible commute benefit would be a piece of what the implementation would entail. Talk a little bit more about the pros and cons for this particular option 2A. I think, again, this is assuming that the option A is selected, which would require the city to remove parking mandates within climate-friendly areas and within 1/4 mile of those. This is something where we would be requiring employers of 50 or more employees to provide a flexible commute benefit to their employees. So, we think that that could have, impact on existing businesses as well as, impact on, basically, other developments where, this could be where this could matter. So, I think that's one piece here. Both the unbundling provisions and the flexible commuter benefit program would impact existing developments, and that's different than option one. We do see this as a lot more difficult to understand and explain, and would sort of increase staff workload in trying to apply these provisions, and would actually cost money to that extent to implement this. It would require new regulations and compliance monitoring, particularly for the unbundled parking provisions. These regulations would not be consistently applied like the option one provisions. They would depend on use and location and proximity, and would have differing impacts in different parts of the city, and could also still result in parking overflow in Lake Grove. So, there are some other benefits similar to option one. There would be additional flexibility for businesses and development, compared to what we have today. And there would be some reduction in regulatory barriers, but significantly more complexity and difficulty in implementation. With respect to 2B, remembering that the sub-option B would be selected here, so that would require the city to remove all parking mandates within climate-friendly areas and within 1/4 mile distance. So, basically, we see there are a lot of cons to this one. So this one would require paid on-street parking. I think that's the biggest one. So this is kind of the parking management approach. And we see that this could have by far the sort of biggest impact on existing businesses. I think that it's really worth pointing out that that would be that could be pretty significant, particularly in somewhere like Lake Grove where there isn't much on-street parking to begin with. So kind of the rough way that we interpret this sort of option is that we'd have to have paid parking for at least 10% of on-street parking within that area. So I think that's kind of the biggest sort of con to point out here, and really definitely a lot more cons than option 2A with this one. All right, so option 3, again, a pretty complicated one. This one would require the city to adopt basically, again, the same either unbundled parking policies or a paid on-street parking district in select areas of Lake Grove and downtown, in addition to eliminating parking requirements for a long list of selected uses. So there would be both these locational and use-based kind of restrictions and sort of overlays that staff would have to sort of muddle through in order to tell an applicant what their parking requirement is under this option. So no parking for option 3, there would be no parking required again within the climate-friendly areas and within half-mile distance of those areas. There would be no parking required for mixed-use development, group quarters, studio apartments, and one-bedroom apartments, changes of use or redevelopment of vacant buildings, expansion of existing businesses, small commercial properties, buildings with a historic designation, sort of buildings built sort of through sustainable building practices such as the Residential Reach Code and LEED, and also no parking for schools or bars or taverns. So no options really here. You are not allowed to require parking for any of those uses. So as you can see, there are a little bit more sort of a mix of pros and cons with this one as well. This is definitely the most complex by far of the available options and would be the most difficult to explain and understand relative to option 2A and 2B. Both unbundled parking and paid parking would have budgetary impacts and really require substantial staff resources to implement. All of those reductions would continue to be based on these kind of relatively outdated parking ratios that we currently have in the parking table as well. So, I think it's just worth pointing out there are also a few pros here. Again, additional flexibility compared to what we have now, but I think we see this as by far the most complex option. And so just kind of looking at the matrix here showing all the different options, you can see that we found that there'd be a lot more sort of pros with option 1 when compared to 2A, 2B, and 3. We presented this analysis to the City Council late last year to sort of get their read on this, and we heard from City Council unanimous support for option 1, repeal all parking mandates. So they were supportive of kind of that market-based approach here to the provision of parking, the flexibility that it could provide to developers, and the benefits that it could have for local businesses. But they did kind of caution that any widespread elimination of parking requirements would need to be accompanied by other city programs to ensure safe and reliable pedestrian pathways, variety of transit options, incentives for sustainable infrastructure, and other investments to promote increased walkability and livability in the city's town centers. So really, they don't see this as all right, we're just going to do this and leave it be or forget about it. There are a number of other things that are going to be required at the same time for this to be successful. So they did acknowledge that. I'll just really briefly talk about some next steps for the project before I stop for questions. As you can see here, this is the schedule for the project. We're currently, in the community forum on July 24th, of course, but we're currently drafting and reviewing internally the draft code amendments to comply with CFEC for review by the Planning Commission and City Council prior to the public hearings. So we did have a work session with the Planning Commission just 2 days ago on the 22nd, the Monday of this week, and we have a study session planned at City Council for September 9th. We also are still aiming for hearing dates, or actually modified those hearing dates slightly. We are expecting an October 28th hearing date for the Planning Commission and a December 3rd hearing date at the City Council. So really pushing up pretty close, actually, to our December 31st, 2024 deadline. But those are the next steps and good ways to kind of get involved with this moving forward. All right, I cannot talk anymore. I would like to pause and open it up for questions, open it up for anything that folks want to ask of me, of city staff, or any questions they might have about the rules. This is your time.
Hey, Eric, I just wanted to note that we do have one question in the comments, as well as a general comment in the chat, not in the comments. I don't know if you can see that or if you want me to read it to you.
Yeah, I can see that. I can try to read that. So she says, can you explain the reasoning behind retaining the parking requirement of 1 unit for multifamily, but removing parking requirements for non-multifamily? Are you aware that there are currently 2 adjacent developments of cottage clusters in first edition, totaling 18 units? Between the 2 developments, only 5 parking spaces have been allocated. So parking in the neighborhood is already in short supply, and this will have a substantial negative impact. It additionally will reduce or eliminate the likelihood of future residents using electric vehicles without on-site charging, taking the city further from reducing greenhouse gas emissions and fuels. I think basically it's mostly a comment, I suppose, about the impacts of the existing Phase A requirements in that part of the city in first edition. So again, we do see that there will be some parking spaces that will be used for those sites. So even though they're not required, it looks like at least 5 will be allocated for that development. But again, these are state requirements. So it's worth pointing out that this is something that the city has to be responsive to based on what the state is sort of telling us that we have to comply with. So this is a state mandate. And it's something that we've already been implementing. We haven't actually seen the developments that you're referring to come to fruition. So it's certainly something that the city will be keeping an eye out on and monitoring as we see those actually be constructed. And we will be monitoring whether additional measures are needed, like parking management, to sort of account for those potential negative impacts. So I think, there's some more comments from Diana here that one can safely assume that developments such as these are profit-driven. No one believes that absent parking mandates, a residential developer will choose to make less money. They will squeeze as many units as possible on a lot, collect their money, and leave. Again, I appreciate the comment. We do see that there is a huge market for parking spaces here in Lake Oswego. It is still a fairly auto-dependent community, and we do oftentimes get developments where the developer is proposing to provide parking spaces where they are not required based on market demand. It is easier to sell units, particularly in areas that aren't like first edition, that aren't sort of more transit accessible. It is very difficult to sell those units without providing a parking space. But that doesn't negate anything of what you're saying. I just wanted to provide a bit of context, and I appreciate your comments, Diana.
And Eric, getting back to Diana's first question, can you explain the reasoning behind retaining parking requirement of 1 unit applicable to multifamily, but removing? So I guess that's we would want to clarify that under option 1, no parking would be required. It doesn't matter if it was for multifamily or non-multifamily.
That's right. Yeah, I think that's important to point out that under the proposed option 1, that would not be the case. I think you might be referring to some of what we were talking about, phase A. I would point out that there is no parking required regardless of what the use is in the bus line 35 corridor where First Edition is located. So there are no parking requirements for multifamily either currently. I was referring to kind of the rest of the city, which is where we currently can only require 1 space per unit for a multifamily development. So that does not apply in First Edition. All right. So yeah, again, there would be no parking requirements throughout the city, no minimum parking requirements under that proposed option 1.
And it looks like Miss Karen Sampson has turned on her camera. Did you have something you wanted to share with the group? Oh, you're muted.
You're muted, just FYI. If you, oh, there you go.
Yeah. Hi, I agree with Diana Schmidt. I live in First Edition as well. Those cottage clusters, I have no objection to the cottage clusters. I think that's great. But those people will have cars and they will have Amazon deliveries and they'll have plumbers come to visit and they will bring cars to the neighborhood. And we all know that. And I understand there's state mandates, but I think the city has to really put pressure on the developers to provide parking. I think the people who live there already expect that. There's no sidewalks on a lot of the streets in First Edition. I get that it's within half a mile of a bus, but those people aren't taking the bus they're not going to solely rely on the bus. They're going to have a car. So whether it's underground parking, whether it's EV parking, I don't care what it is, there's got to be some parking provided. And I think the city needs to lean very heavily on the developers to provide for that. And even if it's not required, there needs to be a very a large amount of pressure put on developers to do the right thing. And I understand option 1 is the simplest for the city, but it may not be the right thing for First Edition anyway, and certainly for other neighborhoods that are kind of on the fringe. So I think you need to listen to these people who are already living in the neighborhood to hear their concerns. And they haven't started building that yet, but you drop 16 cars in a 1-block radius, it's going to have a problem. And I just feel like the city really has to push on the developers to do the right thing.
Thank you, Ms. Sampson. Yeah, I appreciate those comments. And I guess I would point out that under all of the options for compliance with phase B, there would be no parking requirement in First Edition as there is now. So it doesn't matter which option we select, that would continue to apply as it does now. So really, phase B won't be impacting First Edition more than it has been impacted in the last year and a half. I will say, I appreciate that you think that the city should be putting pressure on developers to provide parking even when it's not required. I think we do have concerns about running into legal sort of going awry of the law, I suppose, as we do that, because that would, if the city were pressuring developers to do something that is not required, I think we could be getting afoul of these rules in some capacity. So I would just point that out as well. There is sort of limited options that the city has for compliance.
Yeah, and then I don't know who's supposed to put pressure on them, because clearly there's other people, Diana and probably some other people on this call, who are concerned about that and feel that very helpless. that some developer can just buy a lot and put 8 units on it and not provide any parking. And there will be people who will buy those units because they want to live in First Edition and are willing to park on the street. But it has a negative impact on everybody else who's already there. And the developer is going to walk away. I think Diana said perhaps pressure is not the right word. It's incentives. Carrots and sticks are not an option. I totally agree with you on that, Diana, that there's got to be some way to make it clear to these developers that the people who live here don't want this. The people who are buying those don't want that. You want to walk 3 blocks to go get your car in the morning. So there needs to be some way to incent developers to do the right thing too. And if you have any suggestions on what those can be, then share it with the community. So with realtors, with whoever can create those incentives. So thanks for listening to my comments. I appreciate it.
Well, I appreciate you making those comments, and yeah, I appreciate the idea of, you know, a sort of carrot perhaps to promote or to incent, you know, developers to provide parking. That's something that, you know, I don't have any ideas off the top of my head necessarily of how that would work, but that's sort of something that we can think about. You know, I think I would mention, as a part of this sort of compliance project with, you know, the state rules here, the city will be required to adopt maximum parking regulations as well. So I think there are some things in CFEC where we actually will, for the first time, have maximum number of parking spaces that, again, we are forced by the state to implement for residential uses. I would point out, though, that that only applies to multifamily residential uses for the most part, and there would be no maximum for single family, ADU, middle housing, or anything like that if I'm below 5 units. So there would be no maximum, as there is currently no maximum for those uses. And another thing that we're doing is to, we're actually proposing to increase the maximum number of parking spaces for some commercial uses, just to provide additional flexibility. So if they don't want parking, that's possible. If they want more parking, that's also possible. So really just trying to at least sort of widen the the sort of amount of flexibility that is offered those developers on both sides of the spectrum, I suppose. So yeah, in many cases, we are increasing those maximums for commercial uses in what we're proposing. So anyway, I'm not sure that accounts for what you're concerned about, but I just thought I would mention it. But you know, I do appreciate the comment, and I think it kind of brings to light that, you know, this is a compliance project. This is something the city is doing in response to state rules, and there isn't much sort of room to move. And I think we've noticed that, you know, even under the other options, there are a lot of really negative pieces, including that sort of paid on-street parking component that we really think would have more of a negative impact on the city and make it maybe even harder to park in certain areas. So, you know, again, something that we intend to continue monitoring over time and really paying attention to where these parking issues arise and thinking about what the city might be able to do to better manage those parking issues if and when they arise. So again, our eye is on that, and we will be monitoring kind of how this all transpires. But yeah, I think that feeling of, you know, powerlessness is relatable, and, you know, we are kind of being, you know, these rules are being sort of foisted on us by the state. So that is, you know, to a degree, a big piece of why we're doing this is, you know, we do see some benefits, and specifically when we started digging into it, we saw that there were a lot of benefits, but you know, it is a state mandate that we are required to respond to. All right, well, it's 6:02. I've taken a little over an hour of your time, but I don't see any more questions. Are there any other questions? I think in the chat, I'm sorry, there is a question. Taryn Hatchell said, is there any possibility to offer benefits to businesses or residential uses where parking is made available? There are certain things that the city could consider. You know, I think there are, yeah, you know, there are some incentives that we might be able to offer. I think we would want to, again, you know, not increase the costs that we are requiring developers or businesses to spend. So, you know, I think anything that would require them to build, or any incentive for them building parking, we do have to acknowledge that that would, you know, cost something. So, you know, there would have to be some type of financial, I think, counterbalance to, you know, really kind of make that work. So, something to think about, but that is, you know, not something that we had considered for this part of the project.
Well, the other thing,
And yeah,
oh,
go ahead.
I was
I was
just
just going to read Diana's further comments, but if you have something on that piece, that's fine.
Well, I just wanted to mention that, you know, for many development projects, the builder, in order for them to get financing, they need to show a feasible project. And in many cases, and particularly when you're talking about more denser multifamily, the financing may require them to provide parking. So that tends to be a lot of pressure, because in order for them to get financing for the project, they would have to provide parking. And we had a parking forum with the city manager not too long ago. I think it was back in April. And folks from the North Anchor project were there, and we're talking about the fact that even though they can modify their application to remove all the parking, they're not doing that. They're still providing it. And I assume that there's pressure or requirement from the financing in order to provide parking for that project. So that is one example in Lake Oswego where they could remove all their parking and they didn't. They're still going to provide parking for that project.
You could think, you know, there might be a built-in incentive for providing parking because there is a cost to that can be sort of added to the cost of a unit that somebody's buying. But you know, that increases the cost of housing for, you know, the person that's buying that, you know, in sort of a tangible way, for that parking space to be included. So you know, there are built-in market incentives, I guess, for them to provide parking. I guess that's really what I'm trying to say here. And yeah, Diana just kind of was saying maybe carrots would be, you know, kind of the better way to phrase this as opposed to pressure. And just thanked us for considering this. She says she understands it's complicated, but the unintended consequences are real. And so that's something that, again, we acknowledge that, and we definitely hear what you're saying. And yeah, it's something that we intend to monitor and pay close attention to as we sort of implement these requirements. I will say, you know, we've heard fairly split, you know, sort of reactions to this from community members. Some folks are concerned and some folks are excited. And, you know, it's not really, we haven't heard just one side or the other, I would say. So, you know, I think maybe some folks are also kind of understanding that this is a mandate and there really isn't much flexibility for the city to respond to it. But yeah, I think, you know, there are folks that we've heard similar concerns to what you've posed here, and there are other folks that, you know, have said this could provide us with some real opportunities. So yeah, just thought I'd share that with you as well. All right. I think I'm going to call it a community forum. I'll adjourn everyone unless there are more questions. I really appreciate, again, everyone making time out of your busy evenings to join us and to, you know, ask us questions and engage with this material. It is not the most fun thing in the world to be told we have to do this by the state, but it is what it is. And so we really appreciate you taking the time to kind of unpack this and think about some of the potential consequences. So thanks again for your time, and, you know, stay tuned and stay involved as much as you can. We really appreciate it. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.